Hi, and welcome to the Jack News and our latest Jack News podcast. This is Ron Nielsen. I have with me Kelly Ward. Hi, Kelly.
Hey, Ron.
So we're ready to start another podcast. What do you got going on for the headline?
Ron, the headline that grabbed my attention this week was in the New York Times. It's an opinion piece. The headline reads, "Why the heck isn't she running away with this?" The she is Kamala and the this is the campaign and the election. So I found this to be oxymoronic. I think that the headline, the question actually answers this guy's question, and it speaks to what I think is the current Democratic opinion of the country, and that you don't think like us. So what's wrong with you? Like who would actually vote for Donald Trump? It's like they're apoplectic about anybody who would actually support him. And so to even ask the question, I think is the it's kind of the definition of um, of this entitlement mentality that I think the Democrats have these days.
Interesting. I think you're right about the pious attitude for the progressive element of the Democratic Party. Um, I think that develops from them, them researching issues or researching a subject, and they come to a conclusion, and they believe everyone else should come to that same conclusion, and they don't understand why anyone who's rational wouldn't. So they've developed somewhat of a pious outlook, and they think that they are, the authority, and everyone else is just wrong. So they don't really look at other people's opinions, um, which is kind of sad in our in our situation in America, but that's the case. So thanks. I've got some updates on the latest tracking studies, and these tracking studies are by Survey Fever, and they're Survey Fever's public reports. They come out weekly, and they're sponsored by the Jack News. So I'm reviewing some of these results from last Monday's tracking studies on the presidential election, and we're seeing that Trump is continuing to move forward and is closing the gap from where he was, say, 8 weeks ago. Of the seven targeted swing states in the United States, Trump's leading by four, and he's within the margin of error in the remaining three, which include Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The margin of error I'm referring to is that Trump and Kamala Harris are within a single point spread. The other four, Trump's ahead. If Trump wins any one of these targeted swing states I mentioned, Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, he should win the election. And then within the Senate toss-up races that we're tracking, these are toss-up races that are extremely close and could determine the majority support in the Senate, which is currently held by the Democratic Party. But if the Republicans could win one or two of these toss-up Senate races, they will gain the majority support and the leadership in the Senate. And right now we're showing that the Republicans are ahead in West Virginia and Montana. So that would, if they can win one of those or possibly two of those states, that will change the dynamic of who controls the majority. But in addition, we're seeing that the Republicans are now pulling within a tight margin of error of 2 points in Ohio, and the Republican there, Bernie Moreno, is pulling up. So that's some big changes. I think that we're going to keep following in our next segment of the podcast for Jack News. Also, I want to mention, Kelly, a little bit. I don't know if you've been following these stories that are breaking about. I mean, it's an ongoing story, but this one, it pertains to Kamala's book. She wrote a book in 2009 called Smart on Crime. And the book is getting some heat for allegations of plagiarism. Christopher Rufo, who's an author on his own, has released several lengthy paragraph structures from the book. He's saying they're lifted from another source and they're not cited. So that would be the definition of plagiarism. And then also we are seeing some confusion about, this is an ongoing story, but there's confusion about some of the pictures that are in the book. There's a picture of that shows Kamala Harris as a teenager with a woman who's identified as her grandmother, a black grandma that she's standing with, and they're having their picture taken. Unfortunately, Camilla's real grandmother died 4 years prior to her birth. So that's impossible that that picture is of her grandmother. What do you take on all that?
Well, that comports a little bit with her most recent book, in which she showed a bunch of photographs or several photographs of clearly African American people, and she identifies them as her aunts and uncles in the caption for the picture. And then later in the book, it's clarified that these are friends of her mother's who they spent a lot of time with, and she called them aunts and uncles. So yeah, so she's got a kind of a bit of a pattern of claiming other people as her own.
Well, that's unfortunate.
I want to talk a little bit, Ron, about the GOP support for Kamala. So there's a group of that was formed called Republican Voters Against Trump. I think that's a bit of an offshoot of the Never Trump group. And then there's a list, 300 former GOP officials. So some of them are former elected officials, congressmen, senators, and then some mostly are former GOP administration officials. Some worked for Trump and some worked for prior administrations. Primarily, those folks came out of the intelligence and military factions of the government, so State Department and the intelligence community. So a very pointed, very segmented group of officials, and Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney are getting a lot of play for having supported Kamala, and so I've got a question to you about whether or not any of these folks will sway or move voters.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that, getting support from people, is not uncommon. I mean, most candidates have detractors that run, contrary campaigns. I mean, it's very common for campaigns to, or for groups of people who dislike a particular candidate to then formalize and create some name like they're anti or whatever. And so these folks are anti-Trump for whatever reason, and they're supporting the Democratic side. I don't see that some of them have any play. I mean, we're only talking about the undecideds. The campaigns are about undecideds, not about the stalwart members of the Democratic or stalwart members of the Republican Party. They don't generally change. But you have the independents in play, and that's what everybody's fighting over, the undecideds, the independents. Who are they going to vote for? So how much play do each one of these people have? I don't know that they have much of any, in my opinion. I mean, I think that maybe Senator Flake might have a little pull in Arizona, so that might be some support for them. Some of these others folks may have some support in their own home states or regions. I know they're playing Cheney's up across the country. I just don't see how Dick Cheney or his daughter have much play with anyone that's in the independent sector. So I think they're not going to be moving anyone. In fact, I think they'd probably be turning people off. So I don't know that that's really a big support base. I mean, like I've said before, I think that certain people are really helpful. Like, I think that Elon Musk is a big support for the Republicans. First of all, I think he speaks to a lot of independents, And not to discount the millions and millions of dollars that he's contributing to PACs, but the fact that he's out there, like I guess he's going to hold his own rally for Trump. I believe it's in Pennsylvania. So that would be probably the beginning of several rallies for Trump held by Elon Musk, and he's attended others. I think he moves people. I think, some celebrity folks like Taylor Swift probably could move people if she decided to become active. I think she would speak to independents. But some of these hardline Republicans that move over, I don't know how much they play to independents, but each one has to be taken in its own.
Yeah, I don't think that I really don't think that they will. And in fact, the reason I mentioned that most of these folks are from the military or intelligence community is to me that all struck to a if you want the status quo uh in your government, then vote for Kamala. If you want somebody who the status quo does not trust, right? So this so-called deep state to do the thing that they want him to do, then vote for Donald Trump. And so when he says, "I want to go clean the swamp or clear the swamp or drain the swamp," whatever he uses, he's probably right.
Well, I mean, I'm going to kind of mention this little comment from Donald Trump. He spoke at the Al Smith dinner, and he was relating to a group called White Dudes for Harris, which generally, it can be, I mean, it's kind of Trump's mentality for all. But he was speaking at that dinner and just said that he's not too worried about them because all their wives and their wives' lovers are voting for him. But
Pretty funny.
all right, well, let's take a break and we'll listen to Kelly and Jim for a moment, and then we'll come right back.
Okay.
This segment of Jack News is sponsored by Canonizer.com. Build consensus in a divided world with Canonizer.
Hello, Jack News listeners. My name is Jim Bennett, and I am here, as always, with Kelly Cassidy. Kelly, how are you, sir?
I am doing pretty darn good, Jim. What are we talking about today?
Well, I'm quite concerned about the news that broke concerning Bob Woodward's book, in which he reports that President Trump called Vladimir Putin 7 times after leaving office, and also provided expensive and scarce COVID testing equipment to Russia in the heat of the pandemic without telling anybody in the United States, and at a time when hospitals were trying to get their hands on that material and it was scarce and was not provided. It makes me think that Donald Trump is unfit for office and should never be anywhere near the White House again. What do you think?
Well, this may surprise you, Jim, but I've got a completely different take. Now, I haven't had a chance to read his book, but just looking at the news story about it, it goes on to point out that Trump's advisors and spokespeople have said that this is a completely untrue story. Now, as for the testing machinery, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. In the article from the Associated Press, it points out that many machines were sent to many foreign countries as a show of goodwill. So I think it's much ado about nothing. Another round of disinformation about Trump-Russia collusion.
All right. Well, that's your take. They've heard my take. We want to hear everyone else's take. We invite you to go to Canonizer.com, where you can join a camp representing my point of view, or a camp representing Kelly's point of view, or if you have a different point of view altogether, create a camp of your own. So thanks very much, and glad to be with you here on the Jack News. Kelly?
Thanks, Jim. Check out this and other topics on Canonizer.com. Build consensus in a divided world with Canonizer.
All right, well, welcome back to the Jack News podcast. We've got our next segment talking about our favorite self-proclaimed knucklehead, vice presidential candidate Tim Walz. What did Tim do this week?
Well, Ron, I was really excited that this was going to be a segment that we would have lots of fodder for, because Tim seemed to be a little out of hand in terms of his gaffes and his goofiness, but they tightened him up this last week, so he's on script. But I started noticing that he it's not the what he says, but how he says it. So you remember at the last podcast, you highlighted the fact that he was out for opening day of bird hunting season, and had his new clothes on and new hunting clothes on, and he's got his gun that he doesn't seem to quite have a proficiency of loading, and so there was some suspect that maybe he wasn't quite the man's man that he was projecting himself to be, and a lot of people had some fun with that. And I saw one cartoon of Tim Walz as Elmer Fudd. If you remember Elmer Fudd from the uh, Looney Tunes cartoons, and I thought that was kind of humorous. You know, everybody's having a good time. And then 3 days later, he shows up in rural Pennsylvania, dressed exactly like Elmer Fudd. He had on the red plaid jacket. He had on a camo uh, Harris Waltz hat. He put his foot up on a bale of hay, and he's talking real folksy to rural America. And he's become, it seems, a caricature of what he's there to project. So he's there to project manliness. So he's this ex-football coach. So he's been going to high school football games, and he's kind of looking like a coach, and he's talking to the players and that kind of thing. He goes out hunting. He's dressed like a hunter, and he goes through the rural areas of these swing states, and he's talking the way the Democrats think that rural America talks. And
Well,
so,
that's
yeah,
funny. The Elmer Fudd thing is funny.
yeah,
Unfortunately, there's a difference. I mean, Elmer Fudd knew how to shoot a shotgun, and Tim Walz couldn't load his shotgun when he was pheasant hunting. So I don't know. He's a
yeah,
little bit funnier than Elmer Fudd, actually. I don't know that Elmer ever had that problem.
that's funny. I was also looking at the media appearances for this past week, and she's on her media blitz, or was anyway, and uh, and she got some criticism, rightfully so, for how fluffy that tour was, going on the View and that podcast. Can't remember, Call Your Daddy podcast and things like that. Well, she continued on. She was on Charlemagne the God, and rightfully so. He was kind of pressing her on some issues, but it was supposed to be kind of a fluff piece. And then same time, Trump's at the Economic Club of Chicago at a Bloomberg sponsored forum on the economy. And so I think the uh, the campaigns are much different in how they're approaching the media, and the seriousness with which the Trump campaign seems to be taking the election and swaying voters, and the very casual, very much a personality driven, very much good vibes driven um, campaign of Kamala Harris.
Well, on that Charlemagne the God segment, I mean, he came out afterwards and has said how awkward she was in the interview, and how she ran from the reparations discussion, which, that's interesting. She kind of flip flops around on some of these issues, and I don't know what her take is on reparations now. But I have a couple of comments to kind of follow up with. Immigration, uh, we discussed just recently about how high the immigration numbers have been under the Biden-Harris administration. We're talking, 2.2 million unauthorized people crossing the border. And Trump, when he was in office last year, had 400,000. So we're talking about a 5 times increase in the number of people per year that have unauthorized crossing of the border. And there's a lot of pushback within the Democratic machine about opening that border, and that Trump's too hard on the border, and but they're not much different than other European countries. There's a dozen countries that have passed just recently border rules that are very much in line to what the Republicans were pushing to kind of close off their borders. I mean, it's an international concern to protect the borders of a country.
Yeah, without borders, you aren't actually a country. So we either are all collectively deciding we're not, or we are going to stand by what our borders mean. And on the Fox News Brett Baier interview, he went after Kamala to ask her to confirm if 6 million people, which is the number from the administration, in the last 3.5 years have been released into the United States. These are undocumented crossings. So crossing into the United States without authorization, and their numbers 6 million people released into the United States. That's a big number.
So last issue I want to bring up was Doug Emhoff, and these allegations against him. The latest being that he slapped a girlfriend,
right?
And we have earlier allegations with his nanny, and that he got his nanny pregnant. I guess that's not necessarily an allegation.
That's confirmed. Yeah.
So it's a little different picture of who he is than who the Democratic Party tried to portray him at the start of this whole thing. He's a lot different, and
the new face of masculinity, I think, is what that one particular interview titled him as.
So I mean, it's it's unfortunate the media is not actually covering this. I mean, they're not even discussing this issue, so It's getting very little traction. But anyway, well, that's probably all the time we've got. Kelly?
Let's call it there.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.